Hello from New York and welcome to the winter session of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation Knowledge Against Violence speaker series, Protectors or Predators, Understanding Urban Gang Violence Around the World. My name is Nieleti Hanwana. I'm a program officer here at the foundation, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I do apologize for a slightly late start here, but as I see the final people sort of joining us here, I think we can go ahead and get started. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation examines enduring and urgent problems of violence through basic and applied research. We aim to understand the causes, manifestation, and control of violence. We spread this knowledge to inform policy, practice, and public discourse, and to advance scholarship. And so drawing from the foundation's vast pool of scholars and grantees, HFG convenes the speaker series to discuss timely research and analysis of situations of violence. This is including war, crime, terrorism, intimate relationships, climate instability, and political extremism. Our hope is that this informative space really leads to knowledge sharing, and we therefore encourage you all in the audience to pose questions, make comments, and share relevant resources through the chat function here. Before I introduce our speakers and turn it over to our esteemed moderator, Thomas Abt, I would please allow me to briefly go over today's agenda and some housekeeping items. Our session today will include a moderated panel discussion of about 50 minutes, during which members of the audience are encouraged to pose their questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Following the panel discussion, we'll have about 30 minutes of audience Q&A, where the questions from that Q&A section will be then collated and posed to the panelists by our moderator. Please note that if you're having any technical issues, if you have any resources you'd like to share, or if you'd like to make general comments, we ask that you do so within the chat function and leave the Q&A function really for questions. Before I turn it over to Thomas, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists today. And when I say briefly, I mean it. We will be sharing their illustrious bios in the chat with you, and I don't want to take any more time from the discussion. So at this point, please allow me to invite our panelists and our moderator to turn on their cameras. Thanks. Hi, hello everybody. So Nicholas Barnes is a lecturer in the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews and an affiliated faculty at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. His entire bio will be shared with you in the chat. David C. Brotherton is joining us. He is a professor of sociology at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center, and affiliated with the PhD programs in urban education, sociology, and criminal justice. Adeem Suhail is an assistant professor in social anthropology at Franklin and Marshall College. His research addresses issues in the anthropology of violence, social theory, and urban studies. And Rosette Sifa Vuninga, Rosette, please do turn on your video there so everyone can see you, is an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the University of the Western Cape Center for the Humanities Research in Cape Town, South Africa. Finally, Thomas Abt, who will be moderating today's session, is a founding director of the Center for the Study and Practice of Violence Reduction and an associate research professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Thank you all for joining us. Thomas, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Nieleti. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be with the foundation and my fellow panelists, and with all of you who are attending or participating in the Zoom. We're going to have a moderated discussion now, and I'm going to ask a few sort of opening questions to all of the panelists. And then we're going to transition to a more informal conversation. And then we're going to invite all of you to participate by submitting your questions as instructed, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. We're going to try to keep this relatively informal, and we're going to try to keep these questions and answers relatively brief. So as I've said to my fellow panelists, let's try to be clear and concise, and if necessary, I will maybe potentially gently interrupt to move things along, but I don't think that's likely to be necessary. So With that said, why don't we open up with a sort of a question to everyone. And the question is this. The U.S. National Gang Center acknowledges that there's no universal definition of what constitutes a gang. That said, the center identifies a number of criteria that are commonly used for classifying groups as gangs. One of them is that the group has 3 or more members who are generally aged 12 to 24 years old. The second criteria is that members share an identity, typically linked to a name and other symbols, potentially tattoos, graffiti, things like that. 3 is that members view themselves as a gang and that they are recognized by others as a gang. Number 4 is that the group has some permanence and some degree of organization. And 5th and finally, the group is involved in an elevated level of criminal activity. So for all my fellow panelists, what do you believe are the strengths and weaknesses of these criteria? Do you think they're transferable to contexts outside of the United States? And how would you improve upon these criteria? Adeem, why don't we start with you?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Thomas. You know, I will try to talk about this in as brief a way as possible, which is to say that any such definition, right? Any such enumeration of criteria is going to be a failing task, right? It's difficult. It's a difficult task. It's an impossible task precisely because what they're being asked to do is to translate what is irreducibly a political problem into a technical or policy problem, right? Into sort of something that can be fixed through technopolitical interventions, right? And I think unless we expand the frame to include sort of different modes of social becoming, we cannot actually get to sort of the granularity, the experience of the phenomena, right? One of the problems with defining gangs is also the fact that it is both a folk category and an analytical category, right? So with the US NGC, right, is being tasked to say, hey, listen, can you convert what is happening perhaps in, say, the south of Chicago or in Los Angeles or sort of wherever sort of we spatialize and racialize our gangs, right? And we say, okay, can you make that into an abstract category that can travel? Well, it cannot travel, right? It does not even apply to the context from which it arrives, right? Because it has a folk life and they have to sort of abstract from it and make it into an analytical category. Now, I will finally say that the clue to this, right? The clue to why it is a political problem being translated into a technical policy problem, the clue to that is in the subjective dimensions inherent to criteria 4, right? Which is the idea of criminality. Who determines criminality? We know from research, and sort of I've read some of the co-panelists here, their work on sort of how criminality itself has a very loose relationship with the idea of law, right? And so many sodalities, many groups that would otherwise move around sort of as armies, as policemen, as members of the legislative assemblies who sort of have found ways of circumventing laws or to produce law itself as a domain that decriminalizes actions that otherwise end up producing a whole lot of violence, right? We kind of don't see them as gangs, right? And so the bent of this idea, this determination of criminality always is biased against racialized populations and marginalized groups, and kind of sort of tilts itself in upholding the people of power in any context as if they were not culpable, right? So they cannot be identified as gangs, whereas sort of perhaps they do more violence than putative gangs. I'm going to leave it there, and perhaps other people can add more clarity to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Adeem. I see David nodding a lot, so I'm going to turn to you next, David.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, whenever you folks come up with a definition, you have to always look at the source. And in this, it's it's basically an offshoot of the Department of Justice and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. So it's always it's going to be aimed at law enforcement or encompassing law enforcement criteria. And this came out around, I guess, 95 or whatever. But the original sociological definition of the gang coming out in 1925 by Thrasher actually didn't mention crime at all. In fact, as close as it came to transgression of the law, it said, gangs get involved in conflict, kind of territorial conflict. But actually, it was more about joie de vivre, corps d'esprit, that kind of thing, about finding themselves in kind of sort of adolescent mayhem in the margins of intersectional society inside Chicago. So, we travel contextually from, when we used to look at gangs with a much more humanistic gaze, to when we look at gangs now with a much more pathological gaze and tied to, I would say, neoliberal policing. So it's very problematic, I think.
Thank you, David. Very interesting, and I appreciate you bringing in that historical perspective. Rosette, let's turn to you next.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so the definition of gang in a Bukavu context in Eastern Democratic, in east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, gang, really, we can't really adapt to the USA definition. First of all, another word for gang is bandit. So that's how they call gangs, like people who operate to do crime in a group. So they are called bandits. Okay, and then I'm just gonna get rid of this one.
All right, Rosette, we'll come back to you in 1 second. Totally understand. Nicholas, let's go to you, and then we'll go.
All right, so she's gone. My niece, she just came in, and sorry about that. Okay,
That's
so I was saying the definition is very complex. You can't really adapt. So every time I'm doing research, I have to go through literature and see the kind of definition I would go with it. But at the end, I end up always problematizing the definition in relation to the community I research on. So gangs here is like a term that is used in everyday context to mean a hustler, and also it means a fighter, someone who like doesn't give up in life, who do anything to survive. It actually has a very like kind of positive connotation in our context. But so as to define a gang, the group of criminal I research on, and this also is problematic because they live a double life. You can't really take the risk that all these like four items you use, like maybe there is a common identity of, people are just trying to survive, who are getting together to do something, to get money or to do something. But it's really not something that is permanent. So as last time I was home to research, I identified at least 6 groups that are known to operate in a certain group. They have a name, but then when I return and try to do a follow-up, they've all disappeared. And these are people who live a double life. It means in your community, they don't know what you do, this kind of other activity you are involved in. So you can't really say, like in the context of South Africa, for instance, like this is a group, like a gang, this is their leader, and this is, their territory, and this is their tattoo, and this is how you identify them. So in Congo, it comes and go, and there is something that, make people do certain things at certain times. So like a group in Bukavu, for instance, a group of taxi motorbikers can become thieves when opportunity is given. And whoever they attack, if he's let's say an expert, who's not a Congolese, he would say I was attacked by a gang. But if it's a local, he will say some bandit attacked me, or some motorbike criminals or thieves attacked me. So so we haven't really settled on what gang means, and I saw that as well in recent research in Northern Kivu. So yeah, that's from me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Rosette. Nicholas, let's turn to you.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, especially in a group that studies gangs primarily outside of the United States, because so many of these conversations, at least historically, have been dominated by people who have studied gangs in the U.S. context. So I think I find these very productive conversations to have. So my distinguished colleagues have very well sort of deconstructed, problematize this definition that the U.S. National Gang Center has provided, and I think those are all like really valid critiques. Gang is a term, is a concept that I nonetheless use in my work to describe that I apply to some of the organizations, the social organizations that I study. I think gang, for me at least, serves a bunch of purposes. It's a generalizable term. So I'm taught, much of my research focuses on Rio de Janeiro, but I think the gang phenomenon, if we want to call it that, is not just a Rio thing. It's not just a United States thing. To varying degrees, they're present throughout much of the globe. Whether we call them gangs, whether we call them militias or vigilante groups or, just youth groups of different varieties, I think a discussion about how we define these is important to have. So, I consider myself a social scientist, so I try to, be very careful about when and where I use terms. So I don't want to reify gangs where they may not exist. I find that at least in journalism and maybe in public security, the term gang is overused to apply to groups that I wouldn't necessarily consider gangs. So for instance, in this definition that you've given us, the first item is that the group has 3 or more members. Now, I think a gang of 3 members is an extremely, extremely low bar for what I would term gangs. I try to use the term only for more consolidated organizations. These are groups that have been around for a while. They have many members in a lot of cases. I think 3 members is not really enough to consider a gang, in my mind at least. I consider the question of age as very important. Gang, I think of as primarily youth-oriented. It differentiates it from a bunch of other concepts that we have that apply to groups that are criminalized by the state. These could be, more organized crime, mafias, syndicates. There's a bunch of other terms that people have developed, but I think the youth dynamic of a gang separates it from some of those other terms. And I think in that way is helpful. That said, not every member has to be between the ages of 12 and 24. You can have members of some of these groups who are older, in their 30s, or sometimes even much older, although many of them joined the gang during this period of youth, which is another very slippery category or concept that doesn't always travel so well internationally. The last point that I'd like to say is that gang is maybe primarily or comes from the United States and has traveled around the globe. In the vast majority of places around the world, the term gang is not the actual one that people use on the ground to describe these groups. In Rio, there's lots of different concepts. Throughout Latin America, there's like hundreds of these concepts that could be, a clica, a combo, a banda, in Rio, a quadrilla, and they have sort of loose, trying to translate some of those terms is quite difficult. Nonetheless, I do find trying to define gang a useful endeavor, at least social scientifically. So maybe I'll leave it there.
All right. Thank you, Nick. So the mission of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation is to create and disseminate knowledge against violence. So turning to this subject, however we classify these cliques, sets, crews, gangs, or groups, we know they're often involved in violence against other groups, against members of their own group, and against members of the communities in which they are embedded. how does your conception of gangs, or whatever your preferred term is, lend itself to addressing the violence that these groups are involved in? And let's switch here, and let's start with you, Rosette. Oh, you're muted.
Can you rephrase the question, please? I didn't get it right.
Sure. So the question is, however we classify these groups, we know that they're often involved in violence against other groups, against members of their own group, or against members of the community. How does your conception of these groups, whether you call them gangs or not, or another term, how does that lend itself to addressing the violence that these groups are involved in?
Okay, so in Congo, there is a mistrust from the community to the police. The police is not really the first person to run to when there is a crime. So what happened is these networks, I call them networks of crime or criminals, when they form, there is also some, of course, community response to them. And these are like a very old method where like people get together, mostly also young, and they would like think of how to do to fight crime in their neighborhood. So in Congo, they have varied like different methods triggered by different socio-political events in the country. So I can say like between the war period, like in 1996 up to at least 2003, there were mostly vigilante activities going on in the zone where there were these armed gang, like oppressing people. So the young people came together and were like kind of punishing them in public in certain neighborhoods. And so what happened is that with all these inter-Congolese dialogue, they want to resolve war issues, like get all the people fighting together. They also wanted to involve the community in, trying to find solution to peace. And all of a sudden, the civil society would recruit these community vigilantes and then try to talk to them about working with them, especially because they were like, doing this in a very successful way, because they at least succeeded to scare away these criminals. And so they saw like they could use them to do something. So then they changed to more like human rights method of fighting community, of fighting crime using more human rights approaches. And so that was also around 2005 during the campaign for 2006 elections. So there is a lot that brings these changes, but I can say that the first response comes from the community, but more recently it is the community, the civil society, and the police that are working together to fight crime. And that on its own have created new problems. At the beginning, it looked like a beautiful solution, but then both the criminals and the network of anti-criminals, they are exploiting this solution. So let us not forget that in Congo, both those joining the criminal network and those fighting them are all doing it out of, just to, mostly to survive, like for economic reasons. And so if there is a way that they can think about how to like, they always think about how they can exploit that option, and making something out of it more. And so that's where everyone wants something out of it, and they can collaborate to like transform this into what researchers are calling now economies of insecurity in urban area, or particularly in the conflict zone. So that for me, I can say the community response is the first one, but as I said, with their own problems.
Thank you.
I think the question right.
No, that's very helpful and community-centered response. Nicholas, what are your thoughts?
So I do think it's quite useful to differentiate the different kinds of violence that a gang will engage in. So, thinking about how a gang might use violence internally within the organization, towards other groups, or against people, residents that live in the area in which the gang operates. I think these are useful ways to think about some of the different forms of violence that a gang will engage in. So, building off of the previous discussion, I think of gangs as more consolidated, at least in the context that I study. Some of these groups have been around for 3 or 4 decades. They have dozens, if not hundreds of members. Most of them are quite hierarchical organizations. And so at least violence internally within the gang is used to mostly punish disobedience. Or if someone does something wrong with respect to the drug trade, they lose money or they're not keeping accounts correctly, violence is often used to punish those individuals. So, I mean, this is a way of controlling really the behavior of a lot of these, especially young members within these organizations. So there can be, in certain cases, quite a lot of violence that happens within the gang organization itself. I think probably the most important type of violence, at least in Rio de Janeiro, and from what I can tell, most other places, is the violence that occurs between different gang organizations or maybe with other different types of groups or with the police. This is usually produces the most extreme forms of violence in society. At least in Rio, you often find these groups are highly militarized and they're engaging in warlike behavior. They're trying to invade each other's territory, take it over, expand the drug trade themselves, destroy those organizations or incorporate them into their own. And this type of violence really knows no borders. It impacts all of the other types of violence because it creates a lot of disorder in the organization itself. It creates a lot of chaos around the gang and in the areas that they operate. Gang members are going to become a lot more paranoid when and where this type of violent competition with other groups occurs. So in at least in my research, I find that when and where these gangs are violently competing against each other, a lot of other forms of violence, including against residents in the community, who they, in some cases might fear informing on them or helping their rival, also increase. So these are nice little separate categories we have, but also they sort of feed into one another in a variety of different ways.
Thank you. Adeem, let's get your thoughts on this.
So again, I have complicated thoughts that I'm trying to try to keep them brief, because the question of violence, right? I think you see the question of violence, and I don't want to go too deep into sort of these discussions about subjective and objective forms of violence. Well, what exactly counts as violence, right? I just want to say that gangs arrive within an ecological context, or if we're talking about urban violence, right? Within a city, within an urban context, the gang arrives as an object, right? It comes in, it assembles itself, whatever, groups of 3 or more, right? But there's a context in which, right, there's a certain kind of a relationship of other objects in the field, as it were, in the complex interrelation of which the gang appears as a certain phenomena, right? And so we have to take that into account to not sort of prima facie assume exactly what is it that violence is, what it looks like, right? So in many ways, sort of just building on what David's answer to the previous question was, our assumptions about what the gang is, what it does, and where and how it does it is already been sort of pre-selected for us by our epistemological lineages, right? By Frederick Thrasher and sort of the larger Chicago school, right? That's how it becomes a sociological category, right? Now that may or may not travel, but coming with, along with that comes a certain conception of what counts as violence. So from what I can tell from my research in Pakistan, but also the ways in which gangs percolate in the Western Indian Ocean, it's not a very good category to think about the kinds of ecological stressors, urban ecological stressors that the gangs arrive to respond to. And sometimes they come, they're a subjective form of violence that erupt in a moment of capitalist property regimes and cultures of private ownership and violent appropriation, the unequal distribution of resources and the means of production. There are processes of at the very origin in Chicago, right? What Thrasher and company were looking at are processes of racialization and migration policies and labor regimes, spatializations of poverty. How does one as a group, as a racialized group, and remember, it's not just African Americans, but these are we're looking at the 1920s, where there are Jewish gangs and there are Italian gangs, and these are all racialized populations at the time. They haven't graduated to whiteness in that America, right? Which they do in the course of World War II. So there's that color bar. So we think about that ecology in which lack of housing leads to sort of these sodalities of young men who have banded together to protect meager resources peddled out to them by the Rockefellers of the world and whatnot, right? And so for me, the question of violence then becomes diffuse, right? It becomes an ecological problem. It's for me, then the question of violence becomes, well, what do we gain? What kind of epistemological violence singles out a young racialized minority, right, as an object, as the vector of violence, so that everything else in the background can be characterized as non-violence, as not violent, right? As simply the way things are, as housing regimes and property regimes, right? So I'm just going to say that to understand what gang violence is, we have to think about what its opposite is, which is police, right? Which is another object in the field. Sorry, go on. Yeah,
we'll come back to you. Thank you for that, Adeem. David, your thoughts on however you conceptualize gangs. How does that conceptualization help you address the violence that gangs are associated with?
Yeah, well, first of all, I redefine the gang and talk about them instead of gangs, because I find it so meaningless and pejorative. I found that my work in New York, I had to use another terminology. So I used the concept of a street organization and completely, gave the gang completely different values and criteria, and much more emphasis on culture and politics. But I want to come back because, on violence, my history is quite, interesting, because it's over 30 years that I've been working with gangs. And I started gangs in San Francisco. I'd been a high school teacher there and in a school with 15, 16 gangs, and then wrote my dissertation on it. And I started working in the gang field in the middle of the crack epidemic when I started with drive-by shootings were all the rage. And I was working then with MS and 18th Street. And the whole thing was then, there was a lot of loss of life. And I went to a lot of funerals, a lot of wakes, and it was very troubling. And I actually became very depressed about it because I couldn't see a way out of it. But the thing is, when I started talking to the youngsters, and they were coming in from Central America, Mexico, apart from the Chicanos, the extraordinary violence that they had seen in the civil wars in El Salvador or Guatemala, or being tortured by the federales in Mexico, you could not understand their involvement in violence on the street without understanding their violent histories and the trauma that they'd been through in their countries, where so much of the policy was dictated by the United States. When I came to New York City, I walked into Giuliani time, the epicenter of zero tolerance and broken windows. And then violence here took a form. It was very much a lot of state violence, the street crime unit. Giuliani wanted violence. He wanted conflict against the gangs. And I'm working with gangs, the Latin Kings, whose leader had just received 150 years in prison, and the most severe prison sentence of any federal prisoner since World War II, apart from execution. He was given 45 years in solitary confinement in the maximum prison down in Florence. And I'm working with this gang with over 1,000, 1,200 members in New York City, who was painted as the most violent gang in America. And its rhetoric to the outside was, we are a political movement. We are a social movement. and we're completely against violence. And in fact, they passed all these rules and laws within the group while I was working with them to basically banish internal violence and set up a whole line of mediation with groups, with Reverend Sharpton. And they formed this thing called, what was it called? The Family Coalition, the Street Family Coalition, where they could meet with the King, with the Nyata and the Bloods and the Crips and the La Familia and so on and so forth, through their own devices. This whole thing about gangs, all they do is fight and all they do is conflict. So many gang members and gang histories are filled with peacemaking and coalition building and forming alliances. And oftentimes violence becomes, implosive and destroys their own self-organization, especially if they might be involved in the political economy. So again, it's contextual. We can learn enormous amounts from the gangs and their own history of peacemaking, which we usually reject. We can learn from the truces that they themselves have been involved in. And then when you go abroad, and I'll sort of be quick here, I go to Spain, and there we see, so in New York City, there was no way the state or the police or the government was going to get involved in gang mediation because it completely nullified their political project. When I got to Barcelona, it was complete opposite. The socialist city council, Generalitat, wanted to be all over it. And again, completely redefined the gang and called them cultural groups of immigrants and gave them carte blanche to all their council where they could meet and build on their own kind of peacemaking devices. So these are very different. And in Ecuador, it was different again.
David, let me just stop you there because that's actually a question I want to ask. I'm going to come back to you first on where you ended there because I think that's a very interesting point. So what I'm hearing sort of among the panelists is sort of a bit of a criticism with this American notion that gangs, that a defining feature of gangs is violence. And I think this actually is reinforced by some of my own work, which is rather than focusing on, if you're concerned with violence, my work is focused on violence. It's better to focus on the specific behaviors, the violent behaviors that you want to address, rather than doing it by proxy and saying all of these people are violent. They are our problem. We have to address it there. I also think that that's an imperfect way of doing it because we know that not all gangs or informal groups are equally violent, and not all gang members within those groups are equally violent. So it may be better to say, if your issue is violence, focus on the violence directly, and rather than by proxy. Let me actually just quickly get any reactions to that thought before we move on.
I didn't quite understand it, Thomas, what you were saying. Can you repeat that again? I wasn't quite getting.
I guess what I'm saying is that when we define gangs as violent, we lose a lot of diversity, which is not all gangs are violent, not all gangs are equally violent, and not all gang members are equally violent. And if violence is our top concern, it may be better to focus on the violence directly rather than by proxy through identifying all gang members.
Yeah, I mean, look, real quickly, you cannot understand gangs without understanding the violent context in which they live in. You can't understand gangs without looking at structural violence and what they're putting up with incredible levels of policing and imprisonment and unemployment, lack of housing. I mean, it's ridiculous to just focus on as if there's no direct violence. There's only direct violence, interpersonal violence, but there's no indirect violence. It's absurd. And when you talk to gang members, actually, and you start to talk about violence, yeah, they'll talk about violence, but they'll also talk about education. And they'll also talk about being disempowered and not being able to vote and not having a political party that represents their interests. And they'll also talk about how their family can't afford to eat and they can't have shoes on their feet if they're in the developing world, or not even in the developing world. It could be here in New York City. I mean, so many things, these are all forms of violence, right? And the kids are making sense of life living in this incredibly violent and destructive society. I don't sort of born gang members, even if some of them are born into the gang. A lot of them don't stay in the gang for very long. They get off with their things. So we have to be much more flexible and much more, as Adeem was saying, much more kind of reflexive in how we choose to talk about violence. And then, if we're going to be involved in intervention, understand that the problem solvers are within the community themselves and not outside. And we come in there with a deficit notion of the violence, and we have a quick fix, which is completely preposterous in my understanding.
Adeem, I see you nodding. Do you have thoughts on this?
David said everything that needed to be said. I would have repeated the same things. I would like to sort of, when I began my research, I was going to say, okay, a gangster performs violent acts a certain percentage of the time in their lives, right? What I wanted to sort of approach my book project, which is called Machines of Violent Desire, right? And so it has violence in there, which is to sort of think about, well, what are they doing the other 98% of their time, right? And so, and where are they hanging out, and what are the kinds of things that they're doing? And so in one of the chapters in the book, I'm sort of talking about how a Gates Foundation funded World Health Organization spearheaded multi-million-dollar polio vaccination campaign, right? So polio only exists in Pakistan and Afghanistan now, right? That's the only two places, right? That campaign had so many transnational interests, right? In eradicating disease, good public health, global health effort, right? We will eradicate polio like we did smallpox. And in order for people to do that in the neighborhoods of Karachi that I look at, they needed the gangs. So while the gangs were in power, they were going from home to home, and they weren't showing people their guns. They were using some of their reputation, of course, but they were like, hey mama, can you come out? It's okay, get your children vaccinated, because people were afraid, because for a variety of reasons that I don't need to get into, people were afraid of the vaccines. And the gangsters were instrumental. And so when the gangs were eradicated through military operation, by which the military could come, the Pakistani military could come in and say, we're the good guys now. Look, we killed these people who you recognize, or we recognize as bad guys, right? State formation, right? Well, after that, the whole program has gone to the crapper. Since the gangs were eradicated, the numbers of polio cases have shot up many 100%, right? And so again, we need to sort of look at exactly what social functions, what are the ecological stressors that give rise to this kind of a sodality in any given context. I'm gonna leave it there.
Before I want to explore that, and I want to get back to David's points about Spain. But before we do that, I want to sort of return to this theme that Rosette raised, which is that if we are focused on addressing violence, between and among and within these groups, perhaps the best solutions are community-centered. So, Rosette, I'd like to ask you to talk more about that, explain what you mean by that, and then I'd like to hear the other panelists comment.
Yeah, so the way people fight crime in Congo is the same as they survived for at least since post-independence, in the post-independence period. So Congo is one of those states that rely on informal economy. And whether it is the president of the country or the governor of South Kivu, where I do my research, every time they call people on against crime or to stand up, they just tell them, you have to stand up, take everything you have and fight crime in your community. And so they don't say no, like in other places like South Africa, say call the police, don't take law in your own hands. But there is this the way of, fend for yourself, don't rely on us, don't count on us, we won't help. You have to stand up for your own security. And that's how the community, they know, these today, the criminals of today are children of, parents who were raised just after we were like young, like born after, children of the parents born in the 50s and 60s, and we have known nothing than informal economy. So in that way, it's not a problem, and the community know that they can't really rely on the government or the police to help them. The only problem is that when they are doing it right, then the police will come in or the government will come in, try to now use them, because there is always that moment when they are needed. And as you know, in Congo, the civil society, just like the government, they are all corrupt. So that for me is the same issue. Nevertheless, the community anti-crime network have like set for the best, and I think that they know what to do for themselves than anyone else. And I think that the only problem is that I wanted to say that like they kind of understand. The problem is that there is in Congo, you can say what is illegal is not necessarily criminal. So as much as they want to fight these criminals, they understand what they are doing is just, to survive. And so it's like the community would understand that you rob somebody but not harm them physically, or you would maybe he has $100 US and you just, ask or like rob them at 50 and leave them with something. So they tend to, like, the punishment they inflict on people depends so much on how they judge their crime. So that's also another thing I think which is problematic on its own way. But it just shows you that there is a problem. Like, well, I struggle when I'm a historian, so when I write, I never have to go to the policy part and write some recommendation or solutions to the problem I research on. But I know with Guggenheim Foundation and other places like SSRC research for, I have to provide for, what do you think would make some recommendation. So at this point, I don't know, because the violence is just, it's used to a certain degree, like Adeem said, to achieve for certain means, like it's just used to get what you want, but sometimes it's not, you don't need the violence, you just need to take your thing. And although there is some other kind of violence involved, like psychological violence, but the community is not so educated on that regard, because like they know that if you didn't harm the person probably and you didn't take everything they had, and that's okay. So for me, I always struggle, what are the solutions I should recommend, knowing that there is that big thing that stands there, the socio-economic situation that leads to all this. So you may change the government, you may come up with beautiful policy to fight crime, but that kind of poverty still there, that's a problem. And also there is a war going on in the region. So our war is usually, as you know, is rural. It's happening in rural areas. So what these young in rural area doing, like they are poor and less educated, if I can say that. And what they do is roam from one militia group to another. So it's hard to fight crime in certain area because the same people on the streets screaming about insecurity and protesting against them are the same involved in very same insecurity when it's dark or when the opportunity presents itself. So for me, that's like, I don't know how to really address that. And so how people understand violence is really is different. How we understand violence in my country or in my community, is different from how you understand it. So violence for us is almost like how people understand gender-based violence as violence, physical violence against a woman. They don't think like gender can be also a man, and that violence can be also psychological, not necessarily physical. So there for me. So yeah, I also wanted to mention some of the violence that these people are involved in. The criminals, like it's like robbery, intimidation. There are sometimes beatings, and sometimes they really harm you or kill you, because the danger is that there are also some commissioned crime, and that's another thing.
Thank you, Rosette. Very, very helpful. I want to return, because we're about to turn to our Q&A, but before I do, I want to return to an issue that was raised by David. and get other panelists' thoughts. Which is, there are varying strategies around the globe with dealing with identifying and engaging and dealing with gangs. One question is whether governments should engage with gangs as anything other than criminal organizations that are targets for law enforcement. We've seen examples of gang truce that are negotiated either explicitly or implicitly with the assistance of government. We've seen negotiated deals behind closed doors in certain places. And so I'd like to know, Rachel Kleinfeld talks about this in her book. Now the title is escaping me, but so I want to know what are the relative merits and risks for governments in engaging with these groups that we're calling for the purposes of this conversation, understanding all of the limitations associated with that term as gangs. Nick, let's go with you. Start with you here. Nielletti, our moderator, is very helpfully reminding me that the book is called The Savage Order by Rachel Kleinfeld. Thank you, Nielletti. Nick.
I think this is a really important set of discussions in terms of public policy that needs to be had, not just in Brazil, but throughout Latin America, the United States, and other places where gangs exist. I think, mediation, negotiation between these organizations and certain members of the community that could involve public security or public policy has been happening for quite some time informally in a lot of places. Some of what's been happening more recently is where you get high-level government officials, political parties that advocate for peace agreements, negotiations, that brings all of these groups to the table. You saw this with MS-13 and El Barrio 18 in the Northern Triangle, in Belize, in Colombia. There's been cases of this in certain cities of the United States. This has been happening as well. I think, it's much better than mano dura or hard fist policy. It's cracking down on them. And in the short term, we've seen that levels of violence can come down dramatically in society, bringing these groups together, trying to stop whatever violence is occurring between them. I think in the long term, it's insufficient to deal with a lot of the problems that David and Adeem and Rosette have pointed out, that this is not a panacea to marginalization, over-policing, these sorts of problems that are going to continue to give rise to these types of organizations and have communities that really rely on them for a lot of goods and services. Gangs, again, coming back to a point that we've reiterated a couple of times already, these are not uniformly violent organizations. All of them, at least emerged initially more for protection of young men primarily, but occasionally women. In addition, they have a lot of benevolent or more ordered activities that they can provide to communities. It's almost never really considered in terms of public policy, what these organizations are actually doing for communities. What we've seen, however, is that when you bring all of these groups to the table, unless you have politicians who are going to stick around for a long time, which is almost never the case in most democracies, and these negotiations usually break down when you get another political party that makes this sort of very easy, rhetorically at least, argument that these people are soft on crime, they're working with criminals, and then you get a shift in policy and the negotiation breaks down. In addition, in other places, you've seen that the gangs have purposefully broken these negotiations to try to get something more out of the government, either like it could be incarceration policies, they want more lenient ones, they want their leaders want access to more political or social or economic capital. So I think that these are short-term solutions to much longer, bigger structural problems that we aren't addressing. I think, I mean, at least in the context that I study, I think drug policy is a much better route to go down. Negotiation, mediation is not going to be a long-term solution. I think thinking more structurally, thinking about drug policy in particular, as most of the organizations that I study make a lot of money off of the illegal drug trade, and then how do we, as a society, try to move away from this prohibitionist framework that incentivizes the creation of these organizations, their competition over illicit markets, their growth over time, is going to be more productive in the long run. But I think negotiation and mediation is absolutely a tool that most governments should be implementing, at least informally, if perhaps not more formally.
David, I'm going to give you a 1-minute response because you raised this, but then I want to ask my wrap-up question and make sure that we have time to bring in the audience. So 1 minute on this, please.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Mediation, find the leaders that you can talk to, that are willing to sit down with you and begin a different kind of discourse and less stigmatizing and more inclusionary. And most of the countries, especially countries with high levels of drugs, you have to do that anyway. I mean, that's just realpolitik. You've got to do that. You can't adopt this crazy zero tolerance, which comes again from the United States, exports one of the worst policies in the world to the rest of the world, and then supplies them with criminal justice, weaponry, and God knows what, which you saw in absolute catastrophe in Central America. Bukele, becomes like a quasi dictator on the back of all this. But where you've got negotiations in good faith with other things surrounding it, you start the process of talking, and then you start talking about, well, what else do you need, right? What else can we do? What else can we bring to the table? And you start this real, kind of as equals at the table, which they've never really seen before. And where it's happened, I think it's been very successful. Petro's doing it now in Colombia because he has to survive.
Okay, thank you. So I want to wrap up and ask our final question. The title of this session has been Protectors or Predators, Understanding Urban Gang Violence Around the World. So let me ask each of you directly, how should we view gangs? Should we see them as protectors, as predators, a bit of both, or something else entirely? Adeem, I'm going to come back to you again first.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to try to answer this in a way that also addresses the previous question, which is to say,
Sure.
I think it's important that we start thinking of gangs not simply as a category, right? Neither protectors nor predators, but as a process, right? So we convert, so police, again, we think of the police as a kind of a group, right? As an institution. It's a process. It's a social process, right? It has everything to do with the articulations of power. And so the question then becomes, where in that process, at what scale does the gang protecting certain interests in certain communities, and where those the processes that enable that protection function in some respects at a certain scale become predatory at another scale in another spaces, right? So for instance, in considerations of gendered violence, in considerations of the proliferation of drugs, and sort of what Rosette very importantly pointed out, psychological violence. And so I think it's a complicated question, and it goes together with the question of the police as a sociological process through which we have an institutionalized, well-funded process through which we criminalize, right? We articulate certain groups as criminological in order to work on them, sometimes mano dura, right? Sometimes sort of with the hard fist, at other times through engagement, right? And so it is through the undulation of these different regimes of articulating power that here it becomes a protector, there it becomes a predator. And so then the question becomes larger than that, which is to say, what are the processes into which are enveloped the lives of the young in our cities, right? And if you start asking the question in those terms, right, access to education, access to sort of drug enforcement policies, what do we do with police? What do we call police? What is legitimate modes of interaction between people in power and those on whom power is exercised, and what are the interfaces? I think that will go a long way in addressing that question.
Thank you. Rosette. You're muted again.
I was saying I agree with Adeem. This is not a simple question. So to answer it, you have to understand what does it mean to be a man, you know, where I come from, where I research. Because for their families, these men are like protectors, because they go out every day to get something and then, you know, to feed their family, to do all this. But when they are caught, they become predators. Okay, so that's where the challenge lies. So as long as, you know, they are just trying to, there are so many like you know, this whole belief, masculinity, you know, culture and thing. You can't just sit home and expect to be respected. So being a gangster in this way, in Bukavu, for instance, is just being a man. You can't say, I don't want to do something illegal, I'd rather die with anger. That's unacceptable. You'd rather be in prison. That way people will know, at least we're trying to be a man and then we're caught. And so I don't really know what to say there, but yeah, not a simple, not a, you know, you can't just answer that question. It's not an easy one in my context.
Thank you, Rosette. Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Rosette and Adeem were saying, especially about the temporality aspect of thinking about a gang as a process. I would say in the organizations that I study, they are equally predatory or, you know, protective. A lot of it depends on who you're asking. People who live in some of the neighborhoods where these gangs operate might see them as a protector against other gangs from other neighborhoods that try to come in, invade their territory, or in areas where gangs often export some of the violence outside of their territory. They never rob within their own territory. They're going to do that in other areas of the city. So I think it very much depends on who you're asking. And I think the geographies that we're talking about are really, I mean, you have to contextualize. These gangs don't exist in the abstract. They're embedded deeply within local neighborhoods, within social networks. They can't be decontextualized. In fact, they don't exist outside of those neighborhoods. If they lose their territory, their turf, they usually no longer exist at all. So, you know, I think, and it depends on within the community. I do interviews. I've lived for a long time in some of these neighborhoods, and there are very divided opinions about the gangs in those neighborhoods. This isn't like everyone within the neighborhood loves the gang or hates the gang. It's much more complex than that. What does the gang provide? Who do they provide it to? How and where do they use violence? These are micro level processes that is just so impossible to talk about in the abstract.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
David, let's wrap up here and turn to questions.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, gangs are terribly contradictory social actors. But that's what they are. They're social actors. They're not just criminal actors. And, you know, this is part of the problem, is that we've turned a social problem into a crime problem. And, you know, if, and like, you know, if you've only got a hammer, then everything's a nail, and that's, you know, bang, bang, bang. That's what is our problem. But these are very complex organizations. They're not simple organizations whatsoever. They have all kinds of community ties and also ties outside of the community, right? So, you know, they're different things to different people. But it depends on, you know, what the community, how the community responds to them. And it depends on how the state responds to the community. So when you start to open up negotiations with folks, you start to see a transformative element. There's other possibilities that gang members can become and gangs can become. But of course, we don't have that kind of imagination because it's always fixed within this kind of, you know, criminality. the criminal imagination, which is very problematic. So we never get to the next step of what could gangs become, or what could gang members become. What's the politics of the gangs? What's the politics of the street? What's the relationship between the politics of the street and the politics of the state? And there's a tremendous relationship. But somehow all we want to talk about is the street, completely separate from governance and and state praxis. And we have to move it to the next level. And especially, this is a fantastic dialogue here, because we're having comparative experiences, which we very rarely get. And I quite agree, with Nick and Adeem. So much of it is dominated by kind of the US-centric, hegemony in criminology and social science, especially around gangs. And it's at the moment, it has so few answers to so few other countries and their real-time experiences. And the protector and the predator thing is very important. But I would also say the gangs as political actors is probably even more important.
Thank you, David. Well, let's turn to our audience. They have a number of questions. Several people have gotten quite specific, and they would like to know what the panelists' views are of the current gang policies in El Salvador with President Nayib Bukele. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. And what I think most people would describe as a very mano dura, very aggressive policy towards the gangs. It's received praise in some quarters and intense criticism in others. So what do any of our panelists have thoughts about those policies?
Well, I mean, I think, quite frankly, it's about the gang as a political football, to build, somebody's authoritarian career. And, another point in time, he was, and I was part of it. I was part of talking in fact, I met in El Salvador with leaders of both Mata Salvatore and 18th Street about 2018. And, and discussed with them, about what their futures were and, what they wanted from what was left of the truce process was very little, but what they wanted from the government. And the government at that point, through its, social tejido, they had this social cloth thing. It sounded really good, and we need to sort of get some kind of other approach to the gangs other than mano dura. At that point, they wanted to discuss and get concessions in the prison, and then we went the complete opposite end. Along with bringing, crypto coin as the currency to El Salvador. But, it was this, using the gang as a political football. And now, of course, crime's dropped because it's, virtually a dictatorship. He's very popular still, I think, Bukele. But solved, actually, it's a very short-term solution to a very long-term problem. And, but it also reflects the political bankruptcy within El Salvador, as a matter of fact, and the fact that the failed governments in the past allowed Bukele to flourish in the present, and using the gang very effectively as that political football. The same as Giuliani did when he came to power in New York City. It's the same as they do in so many other contexts.
Thank you. We have a question about the international community. That's noting that in Congo Kinshasa, the presence of multinationals is there, and others. And what is the contribution, according to the question, of the international community in relation to violence in these in the Congo and elsewhere? How is the international community aggravating this? Making it better or making it worse? Thoughts? Maybe Rosette, maybe we'll begin with you on this one.
Yes, I had already started to unmute myself. Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and it's a question we are all, I think, Congolese is asking these days. So yeah, there's been a lot of change in Congo, 2.5 decade conflict, with the number of multinationals both involved in business of mining and those involved in helping to, we call it to monitor, the conflict, because as a matter of fact, Perhaps since last year, I've been watching the protest against the MONUSCO, so the United Nations mission, particularly in North Kivu and also in South Kivu. We've been really protesting. We wanted them gone. Unfortunately, they were replaced by these other local forces, regional forces, which we now believe are worse. Nevertheless, so the war economies in the Congo, as I said, that are to a large extent like inspiring crimes, even in non-war zones in the DRC. And so we cannot really, it's a big question to answer here because we are involving the multinationals. But I believe anyone can say something there because like a global question. So what do you think? If anyone is familiar with the Congo conflict, maybe from America can also say something. But yeah, so I don't know. So I guess this is also a question I'm asking myself. Of course, I know they are contributing, but I also don't know, in many ways, but I don't know how to, to save the last part of the question, they want the involvement to other states to save the Congolese population from poverty. Unfortunately, I don't believe there is any state that will save Congo from poverty because clearly everyone wants to impoverish it. That thing of King Leopold said of making it a free trade zone, it's just it's just becoming a reality, unfortunately. So we don't know. It's very frustrating, but thanks for asking. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other panelists, maybe not necessarily specific to that context. What are your views of the international community's efforts to address gang or other forms of violence? Yes, Adeem.
Well, I don't know how to one of the ways in which I think President Obama's administration addressed indirectly the problem of gang violence in Karachi, Pakistan, was that it switched its war in Afghanistan to a drone warfare rather than a terrestrial war. Because the very rise of the gangs in the city of Karachi, and this is like thousands of people dying every year for a few years between 2011 and 2016. Well, the gangs rose as proxies for a military government that had US support, not being able to control the largest city, one of the largest cities in the world, right? And so they needed local proxies who could wield violence, deniable violence, right? Non-state violence, to ensure that the docks are secured in Karachi, because 70% of the US supply lines for the war in Afghanistan go through Pakistan, right, through Karachi. And so the gangs that I study arose as partners in the war on terror. Specifically its Afghan theater, and they were also sort of the drug trade that they were participating in. So, the US actually installed certain actors in power when they displaced the Taliban. Those actors, what was allowed was certain a poppy trade, and it was a poppy-fueled government for many years. That was the US's government, the Karzai government in Afghanistan, and their poppy regimes were being channeled through these gangs that I study. Right. And so once President Obama came and it became a drone warfare rather than a terrestrial warfare, the gang problem became an embarrassing vestige for the Pakistani military. And so they went and they did their Manaduro stuff. So again, these things articulate with the ways in which geopolitical concerns also play out. So there's that other larger scale to the gangs. And it's not simply a local etiology of violence, but it articulates with global trends.
Thank you, Adeem. That's very helpful. A question was asked for more elaboration on sort of community-based solutions to gangs. Is there a model solution that any of the panelists can reference? Any? Rosette and then Adeem.
Okay, so for us, I think in the case of Eastern Congo, there is this old model that is called Nyumba Kumi, which is Swahili for 10 houses cluster. It's a model that has been used in East Africa, like Tanzania, Kenya, even Uganda and Eastern Congo. So those are like a neighborhood watch based on 10 house class, although today it can be 20 or even 30 houses. So that's one thing. And it used to be efficient, but of course, it's a very old one. Even they say it in colonial time it existed. And it's been like the model that many of these neighborhood anti-crime network are based on. So I don't know if you can check that one on, but yeah, for the case of Congo, that's the one that inspired. And they just before 2006, before they start being called force vive or life forces in English, my translation. So they used to still to be called Nyumbakumi back then. And I think it's still a very, I can't say very, but an efficient model that has been there for a long, long time and still works to a certain extent. That's when I bring that up. So Nyumbakumi, if you would like to, to
Rosette, if you could, it'd be great if you could maybe post something in the chat so so the audience could follow up. That sounds very interesting. Adeem, you had a thought.
Yes.
Well, I have a small anecdote from Atlanta of community-based intervention, which is that in Atlanta is one of the most unequal cities in the United States, competing with Charlotte and Boise, I think maybe. And so a Democrat-led city government and a Republican governor have sort of both colluded with forces of gentrification and real estate mafias, really, to sort of to gentrify and develop the city of Atlanta by displacing its poor populations, right? And there's specific sectors in the city there where this becomes acute. And so problems became such, the process of gentrification is so violent, and with the police backing these projects, that young folk are becoming homeless and are turning to a life of crime because simply it's a problem of not having bread in the refrigerator because suddenly taxes have gone up, and sort of there's all sorts of, we know the processes by which people are displaced. And so a group of individuals who were former gang members in Atlanta, these OGs, right? Both Crips and Bloods came together in a council meeting and they said, hey, listen, there are these young guns on the streets right now who don't have the experiences we had. They're not organized, and they're just going out and committing these acts of crime. And they were afraid for these young folks, right? In sometimes as young as 13 and 14, because the police in Atlanta, as we found out last week, is deadly, right? The murder of Tortuguita by the police, shot 13 times. And so the OGs became afraid for the youth in their communities, these young guns. And so they came together beyond these gang affiliations and gang lines, banded together, and they would go around in these vans trying to sort of locate the young guns wherever they were found, and they would like pick them up and put them in the van and drop them off at the school, right? So I thought that that was such a organic and almost like beautifully poetic way in which the city of Atlanta and the people of Atlanta were solving a problem that City Hall and the terrible, no good, very bad governor were creating for the working peoples of the city.
Thank you, Adeem. Nick, I saw you wanting to jump in. Thank you.
Yeah, in Rio de Janeiro, it's been very difficult for favela communities. These are informal and impoverished neighborhoods, primarily where gangs operate. It's been very difficult for them to directly address gang violence over the years. It's incredibly rare for them to protest or address the gang directly in a way that tries to prevent gang violence in any way. However, what a lot of the communities have done is try to reduce the amount of very militarized police operations that are going on in some of these neighborhoods that destabilizes the local environment, may lead to even more gang violence. So a few years ago, some of the social organizations I work with petitioned the government to actually put a halt to these very militarized police operations, which involve helicopters and tanks, and in a lot of cases, do a lot of harm to the local communities in terms of days of school that schools can't operate because of a police operation. People can't go to work, their shops can't open. There's a lot of sort of indiscriminate violence which is occurring as a result of these sorts of public security policies. So in a lot of cases, the communities in Rio de Janeiro that have been most, suffered the most maybe gang violence, have tried to petition the government, try to constrain the coercive capacity or the coercive behavior of the state to provide more stable situations in which they can start thinking longer term about addressing the lack of political and civil rights, the extreme poverty that can exist in many of these neighborhoods.
Thank you. A questioner here raises an even more pointed question and asks whether even targeted violence reduction by policing can enhance the combativeness of gangs and make them more violent. And I think that really raises a broader question, which is what is the proper role, if any, of law enforcement in relation to these groups? And I would just point out that my general understanding of the way many of these impacted groups feel is that they have mixed feelings. They often desperately want more law enforcement, but they're also deeply critical of law enforcement at the same time. So what are your thoughts about the proper role of law enforcement, recognizing that nuance?
Well, I haven't had a chance to talk about it. We've got not have much time left, but Ecuador, experience, really needs to be studied. It's the first country in the world that legalized street gangs in 2007 with this, incredibly impressive 10-year drop in homicide from 1,920, 100,000 to 5 in 2017. And what they did at the same time is that they completely reformed the police force and set up a communitarian police force, expelled a lot of the police who had brutal histories and so on and so forth, and then created a third tier, which was these kind of community crime control neighborhood groups, which anyone in the community could join, including all the now by this time destigmatized gang members. And so what happened was that the police regained actually their legitimacy. About 40% of the newly formed police force were women for a start off, which was amazing in Latin America. And there were folks that, and many of them, they were unarmed as well, which was quite interesting. And so there was a whole different dynamic in which the gang members were now players, in building social cohesion or community organization or whatever you want to call it, that was terribly effective. And it happened across very diverse ecological spaces, from Quito, in the Andes with the whole Andean culture, to Guayaquil in the Pacific, which was a very different culture. And now, and I should finish here, now, once they accepted the IMF adjustment plan in 2020 and borrowed 6.5 billion, completely took money, 25% of the budget in the corrections was reduced, completely abandoned much of their social policy. We've gone now, I just looked at paper before I came online, the homicide rate now has gone to 25 per 100,000. In Esmeraldas, it's the highest homicide rate in the world, 77 per 100,000. I was there in 2018, 2019, part of the Guggenheim Fellowship. It was around 18, 17 at the time. And this is where structural violence completely undoes all of the good work, could happen at the community level or the state level. Just like that, within 2-3 years, we've gone, a century backwards, more or less.
Thank you, David. In the remaining moments, if you could, it'd be great to drop a link to some of that work so the folks can look at it. We'll wrap up now. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I want to thank very deeply Adeem, David, Nick and Rosette for a really interesting, stimulating, and challenging conversation, really challenging all of us to really think differently about sort of the about some of the sort of conventions, particularly the United States conventions, in discussing these important issues. So thank you. I've learned a lot. I hope you all have learned a lot. And I'm going to turn it back over now to Nialeti.
Thank you, Thomas, and I echo your thanks. What a conversation. Thank you to our audience for joining us today, for engaging with us and submitting your questions. As Thomas said, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking discussion, which could have continued for several more hours. So thank you once again, Thomas, for leading us in this conversation. Thank you, Nick, David, Rosette, and Adeem for sharing your expertise with us. The recording of the panel will be made available on hfg.org. This will come in the coming days, but in the meantime, if you are hoping to get a little bit more of what HFG has offered through the speaker series, we do have previous discussions, including the drivers of violent extremism in African countries, rising violent crime in Mexico, new developments in far-right extremism in the US and beyond, and that's just naming a few. So please do sign up to HFG's mailing list using the link on our website, hfg.org. Follow us on Twitter at HF Guggenheim and Facebook and LinkedIn at Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. Thank you again to those who have stayed to the very, very end. And what a discussion. And we look forward to sharing more information from each of you in the coming days and weeks. So thank you very much and goodbye, everyone.